So in the previous podcast, I didn't adjust the space over my head, so it's chopped off a little bit, which is considered bad practice by the experts. But anyway, you are here to learn and not to look at my mug. So let's continue with this idea of polycentric governance, again applying to the climate change context. So UNFCCC, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change Secretariat, which is here, is connected to all these things in either direct way or kind of indirect way. I'm having some issues with pollution, but I have to keep the door open because it's pretty warm and I don't have the AC on. So Conference of Parties is something that happens every year where all the signatories of the UNFCCC attend and try to negotiate various issues. And there is a bureau, there is permanent subsidiary bodies, subsidiary body for scientific and technological advice, subsidiary for body for implementation, where you had things like convention bodies, Kyoto Protocol bodies, and I won't read all of these, but you can see here adaptation committee, finance committee, technologies, compliance committee, and you have financial mechanisms in terms of green environment, green climate fund, and other financial arrangements here. Mitigation should be somewhere here. So it's managed somehow in terms of, actually it is just something that is given to countries under the so-called nationally determined contributions, where everybody has submitted a plan on how they will reduce their emission, and usually there is some mishmash done to say they will reduce the carbon intensity of their GDP and not total emissions and so on. But some countries are doing better than others even with these kind of commitments, and people quickly argue that the commitments made are not enough to stay within below 1.5 degree or 2 degree C targets by 2100 with a 67% probability. Just quickly, I have podcasts on the details. These numbers are not really scientifically derived, so there is always cynicism about what they actually mean and what happens if you exceed these targets. That's not all very clear. But what is clear in the meantime is if you look at the emissions of CO2, which is measured very nicely for a long time thanks to Charles David Keeling and his advisor Roger Revelle, who started measuring it at Mauna Loa in the 1950s. Emissions are not really slowing down at all. So 25 years of negotiation with the outcome of reducing emissions expected from the polycentric governance, and it's not happening. So obviously it's not a very effective system in that sense. But that also doesn't mean that everybody is sitting quietly. There are many levels of activities that have arisen to address this problem. So if you are a country that is very worried about climate change and you want to do something about it, you can create a so-called climate club, which is a volunteer organization where you can join, and who doesn't like to be a member of the club? So there is some attraction to being a member of the club and feeling exclusive, but in this case it's an inclusive and ambitious high-level forum for industry decarbonization. So decarbonization is where everything we do, including the water I drink, the clothes I wear, food I eat, and so on, do not cause carbon emissions, but somehow we design everything to be carbon free. So that's decarbonization, and argued to be better. I have podcasts on the so-called carbon trap that you can look up. So this has an outcome desired as industry decarbonization. Who they are: an open, inclusive, and ambitious high-level forum for cooperation on accelerating climate action and increasing ambition, particularly in the field of industry decarbonization, with the aim of achieving the objectives of the Paris Agreement. So it's fairly new in that sense. Currently comprising of 37 members and growing, the Climate Club was launched at COP28, which is just something that concluded in Dubai, as a leading high ambition intergovernmental forum for exchange on accelerating climate action and industry decarbonization. The objective of the Climate Club members is to support the effective implementation of the Paris Agreement and decisions thereunder. So it's not just industry decarbonization. There is a broader goal, but that's one of the main foci. And the idea is here to say that polycentric governance of UNFCCC will continue, negotiations will continue, Paris Agreement, monitoring, reporting, verification, nationally determined contributions, sustainable development goals, all those things will keep going. In the meantime, you may have other entities emerging like the Climate Club, which will try to augment the overall polycentric governance to drive towards reducing emissions, meeting global warming targets, and more specifically, meeting the goals of Paris Agreement, which itself is derived under a polycentric governance for a global scale problem. C40 is a global network of mayors of the world's leading cities that are united in action to confront climate crisis. So they realize that urban centers have a certain typology of contributing to climate change and being affected by climate change in terms of extreme events, exposure to hazards, vulnerabilities, and they are typically centers of economic activity, so they have some ways of combining their forces to learn from each other and work together. So C40 is a global network of nearly 100 mayors of the world's leading cities that are united in action to confront the climate crisis. These reports I'm picking randomly from the internet search are not always up to date, but such a thing does exist, and they are looking at raising climate ambition through 1.5 degree C climate action plan, building equitable and thriving communities, building a global movement, scaling up climate action, facilitating access to finance for investment in green jobs. Okay, so great ideas. C40 leadership standards 2021 to 2024. They have a plan, they have a delivery date, they have ideas to mainstream. Maybe I should read this a bit. Plan: City has adopted a resilient and inclusive climate action plan aligned with the 1.5 degree C ambition of the Paris Agreement and updates it regularly, but we are already crossed this limit temporarily this year, probably because of El Nino and other factors. I have podcasts on that if you want to look up. Deliver: in 2024, City remains on track. So C40 remains on track to deliver its climate action. C40 means each city commits to do this. Action plan contributing to increased resilience, equitable outcomes, and halving C40's overall emissions by 2030. Ambitious goals. Mainstream: City uses the necessary financial, regulatory, and other tools at their disposal. Innovate: City innovates and starts taking inclusive and resilient actions. Lead: Mayor and the city demonstrate global climate leaderships and inspire others to act in support of the Paris Agreement. Corporations are putting out their net zero goals, and then there are people who, non-governmental panels, watchdogs, environmental groups that monitor the companies and their commitments and their transparency, their progress, their credibility, and so on. And ratings are very poor for all of them. So that's something called greenwashing, where there is pressure from the consumers overall for corporations to become greener, more sustainable, and corporations respond by putting out plans and making some noise, putting labels on their products, and doing some action in social responsibility kind of areas. But in the end, the metrics do not show that they are being very effective till now, but that can change. In the meantime, campuses are also aiming to become sustainable and go net zero. So this is from MIT. Fast forward, MIT's climate action plan for the decade set the ambitious goal to eliminate direct emissions by 2050 with a near-term milestone of net zero carbon campus emissions by 2026. Okay, that's right around the corner. We are in 2024 February as I'm recording this. Will they be able to accomplish this? Well, that's a goal they set. So now you can apply the institutional analysis at this scale for sure, which we did for taking classes, but you can also apply this now for net zero action. And universities have polycentric governance. They have board of governors. They have all kinds of review committees. They have departments. They have a president. They have deans. And they have students, they have staff, people who live on campus, come from outside, food, water, energy, transport, health, everything has to be tracked and net zero can happen. Okay, so that brings us to the end. Critical reflections on this thinking globally and acting locally. In this chapter, we have considered the challenges of governing systems at larger scales. Who has the authority and the knowledge to create effective policies? In a large-scale problem, this is really, really important. UNFCCC provides some umbrella for such a framework to set up policies. How effective is it? Can institutional analysis be applied to see whether all the rules, norms, punishments are being enforced and the desired outcome is, being pursued appropriately and at appropriate speeds with resources, knowledge, and so on and so forth. To address global problems requires global level action, but this does not mean that we have to wait for binding agreements between nations. Right? Climate clubs are something we looked at where countries voluntarily combine, C40 cities voluntarily combine to develop plans and try to implement them and learn from each other without any binding agreement. Global level actions could be initiated by many level initiatives where communities implement policies in their context to meet global ambitions. Okay, now you make yourself think. List some examples where poor communication between multiple levels of governance has caused a problem for you or a family member or a friend. Okay, you can think of many things, but try to think of big problems and not a speeding ticket or camera trap and so on, right? What does the history of climate negotiations suggest about the potential for Earth system governance? What do you think would be required to make it work? This is a real big challenge and probably the holy grail of the climate change issue. And there are definitions called wicked problems, where you have problems like abortion, guns, education, healthcare, religion, and so on. You have to be careful how you say it, but these are problems where people don't agree upon what to do together to resolve things, let alone solve things. So these are problems that actually don't have a solution. So they get resolved with some compromises, and after some time that compromise is going to be revisited because people again develop new ideas on disagreeing and then it has to be resolved again. So climate change is a quintessential wicked problem, and I have podcasts on that if you want to follow up by what we mean. So thinking about climate negotiations for a wicked problem then tells you what a difficult challenge it is, considering the number of players and the number of feedbacks. The system has enormous number of feedbacks with solutions that emerge without warning, right? We call them tipping points, surprises, but I want to be careful on using terms. From an institutional or ostromological, corresponding to Elinor Ostrom, perspective, what are the key imperfections in global governance systems? What are the key imperfections? Right? So if you think about corporations, profit motives make them cheat on their commitments, and they do what is called greenwashing, where, like whitewashing, they'll just say that they're doing something that's green and sustainable, but they will be just lying. So at global scales, there are geopolitical conflicts, Russia invading Ukraine, Hamas doing something with Israel, Israel fighting back, and there are many issues, many countries involved in many proxy wars here and there, pandemic coming and hitting the system and we not responding properly, or even learning to improve our responses for the future and so on. So one can think of many imperfections, but you have to boil it down to say what are the key imperfections. In my mind, we are the key imperfections. We are human beings. We will never be perfect, but we keep on trying to do things together because this is how we have evolved. Cooperation is a big part of our evolution, so maybe there are not many other imperfections other than what we carry as our evolutionary baggage. But that's my view. So you need to think about from an institutional perspective what the key imperfections are. We are the institution, we build the institution, but nonetheless let me not pontificate more on that. So you think for yourself and come up with institutions and the key imperfections in the global context, and you can choose Earth system governance as the example to deal with for your critical thinking and asking yourself the key questions. Okay.